He stood in the courtroom in Fairfax County, Virginia on March 7, 2025. A man in his mid-50s, large build, slightly rounded shoulders, face showing almost no emotion. Stephan Smerk had waited for this day for a very long time, but not with anxiety. As the prosecutor began reading the details of the case one by one, he merely gave a slight shrug. No bowed head, no reaction, not a single clear sign of remorse. His demeanor in the courtroom drew attention from many, because what was being recounted was a murder that happened nearly 30 years earlier.
I startled her. She got out of bed. She was on her knees. She was just begging for her life. I cut her up pretty good.
On November 20th, 1994, a woman named Robin Warr Lawrence was killed in the bedroom of her home in West Springfield, Virginia. She was 37 years old, a mother, and that night she was stabbed 49 times. The attack was so ferocious that investigators later described the scene as one of the most violent they had ever seen. But for many years after the crime, the killer believed he had gotten away with it. No witnesses, no fingerprints at the scene. The DNA sample obtained also did not match anyone in the database for years. While Robin Lawrence's family tried to move on after the tragedy, Stephan Smerk continued his life as if nothing had happened. He moved to the town of Niskayuna in New York State, worked as a software engineer and computer programmer. He got married, had 2 children, no criminal record. To his neighbors and coworkers, he was just an ordinary man living in a quiet suburb. But in the old case file of the Fairfax County Police Department, one small detail never disappeared: a blood-stained washcloth found in the bathroom of the house where Robin was killed. For many years, the DNA on that washcloth led to no name, until investigators began using a new method after 2019, a method called genetic genealogy, which allowed them to compare DNA with genetic genealogy databases and trace family branches across generations. Ultimately, all those branches converged on one single name: Stephan Smerk. This is the case of a young mother murdered in her own home, and a killer who believed time was long enough to bury the crime. And every detail you are about to hear is verified through court records, police reports, investigative documents, and official prosecution files. On November 20, 1994, the house on Resica Lane in the West Springfield area looked like any other family home in the quiet Fairfax County neighborhood. 2-story houses, front lawns, cars parked in driveways. From the outside, there was no sign that a tragedy had just occurred inside. At the time, Robin's husband, Ollie Lawrence, was on a business trip in the Bahamas. He worked in the aviation industry, and this trip had been scheduled in advance. Throughout the weekend, he tried calling home multiple times, but got no answer. At first, he thought Robin might be busy or out with their daughter, but as hours turned into days with no one picking up the phone, worry began to set in. Finally, Ollie called one of his wife's close friends, Lori Lindbergh, and asked her to stop by the house to check on Robin. Lori agreed immediately. She drove to the house that Sunday afternoon. Everything looked unusually quiet. The front door was closed and no one answered when she knocked. No footsteps from inside, no sound of a child. She walked around to the back of the house and stepped onto the rear wooden deck. And it was there that she saw the first thing that made her feel something was wrong. The screen on one of the rear windows had been cut open. It was not a natural tear. It looked as though someone had used a knife or sharp object to slice it open. Her heart began beating faster. Not knowing what was happening inside, she decided to climb through that window to enter the house. Once inside, the house was terrifyingly silent. The air felt heavy. Then she saw small movement in the hallway. A toddler was walking toward her. It was Nicole Lawrence, Robin's 2-year-old daughter. Nicole looked at Lori with big eyes and an almost blank face. The child did not cry, did not speak. She just stood there looking, as if she did not understand what was happening around her. Lori walked toward the master bedroom. From the hallway, she could see part of the room inside, and what she saw made her immediately realize something horrible had happened. There were large red streaks on the walls. Blood spattered on the walls and floor. Looking more closely into the bedroom, Lori saw Robin Lawrence lying motionless. The room showed signs of a fierce struggle. Lori immediately left the house and called 911 in a state of panic. Within minutes, Fairfax County police officers and investigators began arriving at the scene. From the very first moments, they recognized the level of violence in the attack. Robin Lawrence had been stabbed a total of 49 times. There were defensive wounds on her hands, signs that she had tried to fight off her attacker in her final moments. The bedroom also showed evidence that the victim had tried to move and struggle during the attack. Investigators also discovered that the phone cord in the room had been cut. That indicated the killer did not want the victim to have any chance to call for help. But the detail that many at the scene could never forget involved Nicole. Based on the last contact time with Robin, investigators believe the child had been in that house for nearly 2 days after the murder occurred. Nicole had been there, in the same house, around her mother's body. Upon closer examination, police found small items scattered on the floor and near the bedroom. There were tissues. There were also baby bottles. For the investigators, those details suggested a heartbreaking possibility, that during the time she was alone in that silent house, Nicole may have tried to do the only thing a 2-year-old knows to do when seeing her mother hurt. Tried to help her mother. Perhaps the little girl had brought tissues to place near the wounds. Perhaps she had brought a bottle to her mother the way a child often does when seeing an adult lying down. No one knows exactly how Nicole experienced those hours. This was not just a murder. It was a brutal attack that occurred right in the victim's home, in front of her 2-year-old child. When the crime scene was secured that afternoon, November 20th, 1994, officers set up caution tape, brought forensic experts inside, and began documenting every detail. Every room was photographed. Every trace was marked. Investigators moved slowly through the house, trying to reconstruct what had happened before Robin Lawrence was attacked. One of the first things they noticed was the rear window where Lori Lindbergh had climbed in. The window screen had been cut with a sharp object. The cut was clean and deliberate, that showed this was not an accident, but an intentional act. Outside the window was the rear wooden deck of the house, an area anyone could access without being noticed from the main road. Investigators believed the killer may have climbed up from that deck area, cut the screen, and entered the house. In the bedroom where Robin was found, signs of a violent struggle were evident. Furniture was displaced. Bed sheets were pulled off the bed. Blood was spattered on the walls and floor. But even though the scene showed extreme violence, the killer appeared to have left no clear fingerprints. Forensic experts checked surfaces in the bedroom, doors, tables, cabinets, and many other items. However, no fingerprints were clear enough to identify anyone. As they continued searching other areas of the house, a small detail in the bathroom caught the attention of one investigator. On the towel rack near the bathtub was a small washcloth, the kind typically used to wash the face. On that washcloth was a small reddish-brown stain. Upon closer inspection, investigators realized it was blood. Notably, the blood appeared on both sides of the washcloth, as if someone had used it to wipe a wound. The washcloth was collected as evidence and sent to the forensic lab for analysis. In 1994, extracting DNA from a blood sample was possible, but still a relatively new technique in criminal investigations. Forensic scientists worked with the blood from the washcloth and eventually obtained a DNA profile. Investigators believed the DNA sample could belong to the killer, especially if he had been injured during the struggle with the victim. However, even with DNA, the big question remained: whose DNA was it? In the early stages of the investigation, police also had to look at those closest to the victim, and the first person on that list was Robin's husband, Ollie Lawrence. As investigators began looking into Robin and Ollie's personal life, they discovered a detail that could become a potential motive. Ollie was having an affair with a coworker. In many family murder cases, an extramarital relationship often makes the spouse the prime suspect, so investigators could not rule out this possibility. But Ollie was not in Virginia that weekend. He was in the Bahamas on business. To verify this, investigators conducted a detailed check of his travel. They reviewed flight records, hotel schedules, and statements from those who were with him on the trip. Eventually, some investigators even flew to the Bahamas to confirm the information in person. The results showed that Ollie Lawrence was indeed out of state at the time of the crime. Flight records, hotel staff, and traveling companions all confirmed he was in the Bahamas throughout the period Robin was killed. That cleared him from the list of primary suspects. Meanwhile, the DNA sample extracted from the washcloth in the bathroom was entered into the FBI's National DNA Database, known as CODIS, short for Combined DNA Index System. CODIS allows law enforcement agencies to compare crime scene DNA with DNA from people who have been arrested or convicted in other cases. If the killer had ever been arrested or had a record in the system, a match could appear. But when the DNA from the Robin Lawrence case was entered into CODIS, the result came back empty. In the months that followed, investigators continued pursuing various leads. They checked everyone in the neighborhood, reviewed crime reports in the area, and tried to find anyone who might have seen something unusual that weekend. But each lead gradually went nowhere. No witnesses, no clear suspect. And the DNA obtained from the scene also did not match any records in the database. As time passed without new leads, the Robin Lawrence case file was eventually moved into what law enforcement calls a cold case. Throughout the years that followed, the name Stephan Smerk never appeared in any investigative reports. No one in the Springfield neighborhood ever mentioned him. None of Robin's acquaintances could point to any connection with him, and it was precisely that complete absence from the investigative record that made the later story so much more chilling. Stephan Smerk was born around 1971. At the time Robin Lawrence was killed in November 1994, he was just 22 years old. Back then, Smerk was a young soldier stationed at Fort Myer, a military base in Arlington, Virginia, not too far from Robin's home in West Springfield by car. For many years, there was no evidence that he had ever had contact with Robin Lawrence before. No personal relationship, no conflict, no traditional motive of the kind seen in acquaintance murders. But when Smerk was finally identified as the suspect and questioned in 2023, what he recounted revealed a terrifying picture of the night of the crime. According to Smerk's confession, that evening he had been drinking beer. Not only that, he had also used ephedrine, a stimulant common at the time, often sold in weight loss or energy-boosting products. Ephedrine can increase heart rate, create a sense of stimulation, and sometimes cause impulsive behavior. Smerk said that after drinking alcohol and using the stimulant, he drove away from the area where he was staying and headed toward the residential area in Springfield. He told investigators that he was familiar with the area because he had visited friends who lived nearby before. But that night, his drive was not a visit to friends. According to his own statement, he went to that neighborhood with a different intention. When approaching Robin Lawrence's house, Smerk did not enter impulsively. He had prepared in advance. He wore a ski mask to cover his face and gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. These details showed that his actions were not entirely random or thoughtless. They showed at least some level of premeditation before breaking into the house. After cutting the rear window screen and climbing inside, what happened in Robin Lawrence's bedroom led to one of the most violent attacks in Fairfax County's investigative history. But what chilled many people was not just the act of killing itself, but the way Smerk spoke about it nearly 30 years later. During the interrogation, he made a statement that many investigators could not forget. He said, "I am a serial killer who has only killed once. A serial killer who has only killed once." That statement reflected how he viewed his action, almost as an identity he assigned to himself. When criminal behavior experts analyzed the case, some suggested it could be a type of murder known as mission-oriented homicide. In this type of crime, the perpetrator does not necessarily know the victim beforehand. Instead, he seeks out a target to kill, often driven by a personal motive or a distorted idea in his mind. That could explain why Robin Lawrence appeared to have been chosen randomly that night. In his statement, Smerk even said that one of the reasons he joined the military when young was because he wanted to kill people. That was a statement that later made many people think about how someone could carry such violent thoughts while still living in society without anyone noticing. But perhaps the most striking thing is what happened after the murder. Smerk was not arrested. He did not become a primary suspect in the initial investigation. No one in the Springfield neighborhood knew him. And so, he returned to normal life. In the years that followed, Smerk left the military. He moved to New York State, to the town of Niskayuna, a quiet suburb in the northern part of the state. He found work in technology, working as a software engineer and programmer. He got married, had 2 children, no criminal record. To those around him, Stephan Smerk was just an ordinary man who went to work every day, came home to his family in the evening, and lived a life that gave no one reason to suspect anything. By the late 2010s, a new technology began changing the way investigators approached cold cases that had lingered for decades. That technology is called genetic genealogy. Instead of only comparing suspect DNA to criminal records in the CODIS system, this method allows investigators to compare crime scene DNA with genetic genealogy data voluntarily shared by millions of people in public databases. Around 2019 to 2021, Fairfax County investigators decided to try this method with the DNA sample that had been extracted from the blood-stained washcloth in the bathroom of the house where Robin Lawrence was killed. That DNA sample was reanalyzed with more modern techniques, then uploaded to genetic genealogy databases such as GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. When results began to appear, they did not immediately lead to a specific name. Instead, the system returned people who shared small DNA segments with the unidentified suspect, meaning very distant relatives, possibly relatives 4, 5, or even 6 generations back. For the investigators, that meant they had to build an extremely large family tree. At this point, a volunteer genealogist named Liz joined to assist the investigation. Liz was not a police officer and did not work full-time for the investigative agency. Genealogy was just a personal hobby for her, but she believed she could help victims' families find answers in unsolved cases. Investigators gave Liz the list of people with distant DNA connections to the unidentified suspect. That list had about 1,500 people, From those scattered names across many different families, Liz began the most patient and meticulous work of the entire investigation. She traced each family branch, checked birth, marriage, and death records, traced back many generations in the family trees. That work lasted not weeks or months, but years. After about 3.5 years of research, Liz finally discovered a crucial intersection point. Two entirely different family branches in the final family tree converged at a couple who lived many generations earlier. When tracing all the descendants of that couple to the present day, the list of potential suspects began to narrow, and one name began to stand out: Stephan Smerk. When Fairfax County investigators checked information on Smerk, they discovered a detail that particularly caught their attention. In 1994, Smerk had been a soldier stationed at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia, just a short drive from where Robin Lawrence lived. That meant he was fully capable of being in the West Springfield area at the time of the crime. To take the next step, investigators decided to go meet Smerk in person. In 2023, they flew to the town of Niskayuna, New York, where Smerk was living with his family. When they arrived at his house and introduced themselves as investigators from Fairfax County reviewing a case from the 1990s, Smerk did not seem surprised. He did not react strongly, did not ask many questions. When the investigators asked permission to take a DNA sample for comparison, he agreed almost immediately. Investigators later said they were used to people asked to provide DNA, usually having many questions, but Smerk did not. He signed the consent form, provided the DNA sample, and the meeting ended in just a few minutes. However, what happened next surprised even the investigators. Not long after they left his house, Smerk called one of the investigators. He said he was standing in front of a local police station in Niskayuna and wanted to turn himself in. The police station door was closed at the time, and he asked what he should do next. The investigators told him to call 911 so local police could respond. That call was quickly recorded. When Smerk was brought in for questioning, he began recounting what had happened the night Robin Lawrence was killed. Meanwhile, the DNA sample he provided was sent to the lab to be compared with the DNA from the washcloth collected at the scene in 1994. The results came back confirming what the investigators had suspected. Stephan Smerk's DNA matched the blood on that washcloth. After nearly 30 years, scientific evidence had finally reconnected the most important piece of the case. When the case went to trial in Fairfax County, prosecutors presented the entire chain of evidence collected over the years, from the 1994 crime scene, the blood-stained washcloth in the bathroom, the DNA analysis process, to the genetic genealogy technology that traced the family tree across generations to identify the suspect. In the face of that evidence, he officially pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the killing of Robin Lawrence. On March 7, 2025, nearly 30 years after Robin Warr Lawrence was murdered in her home in West Springfield, Stephan Smerk appeared for the final sentencing. In the courtroom that day were many people who had waited for this moment for decades, including prosecutors, investigators who had worked on the case file, and most importantly, Robin Lawrence's family. Among them was Nicole Lawrence, the 2-year-old girl once found wandering in the house after the murder, now an adult. Robin's siblings also sat in the courtroom, quietly watching as the case was recounted before the court. When the hearing began, the Fairfax County prosecutor presented the key details of the case again. He described the 1994 attack as one of the most brutal murders the Fairfax district had ever witnessed. Robin Lawrence, a 37-year-old mother, was stabbed 49 times in the bedroom of her own home. Defensive wounds on her hands showed she had desperately tried to fight off her attacker. And after the attack ended, the killer left the house, leaving behind a 2-year-old child inside for nearly 2 days. As those details were read aloud in the courtroom, many in the victim's family bowed their heads or held each other's hands tightly, but many eyes also turned toward the defendant. Stephan Smerk sat at the defense table with an almost unchanged expression. Witnesses later said that throughout the hearing, he appeared remarkably calm. Sometimes he gave a slight shrug, as if what was being said did not bother him. That attitude made some people in the courtroom feel outraged. For Robin Lawrence's family, they not only had to hear the details of their loved one's death again, but also had to see the person responsible for that murder seemingly showing no clear emotion. The defense attorneys offered arguments to explain Smerk's behavior in 1994. They said that at the time he was a young man dealing with many personal issues. According to them, Smerk had a history of alcohol abuse and use of stimulants, including ephedrine, a substance once common in energy-boosting products in the 1990s. The attorneys also said that Smerk was later diagnosed with bipolar II disorder, a form of bipolar disorder that had not been detected or treated at the time of the crime. According to their argument, the combination of alcohol, stimulants, and untreated mental condition may have contributed to the violent behavior that night. But prosecutors emphasized that regardless of the defendant's personal circumstances, the nature of the crime remained unchanged. They repeated the number 49 stab wounds, a prolonged and extremely violent attack, not an impulsive act in a few seconds. They also recalled a detail that many in the courtroom had never forgotten. After killing Robin Lawrence, the killer left the house and left behind a 2-year-old child. Nicole Lawrence had been in that house for nearly 2 days, around her mother's body, before being found. For the prosecutors, that detail showed the level of cruelty in Smerk's actions. When it was the victims' families' turn to speak, many expressed anger and pain at the thought that the killer had lived freely for nearly 30 years. During that time, he built a new life, had a family, had a job, and lived in a peaceful suburb. Meanwhile, Robin Lawrence's family had to live with a question that never had an answer. The hearing that day was not just a legal step in the trial process, but also the first time in many years that the victim's family got to see the person responsible for Robin Lawrence's death standing before the court. For many present in the courtroom, that moment brought both the feeling that justice was finally beginning to be served and the reliving of all the pain that had lasted nearly 3 decades. When the attorney's presentations concluded and all evidence had been presented to the court, the hearing moved to the next phase of sentencing, where the victim's family was invited to speak about the impact the crime had left on their lives. For Robin Warr Lawrence's family, this was not just a procedure in the trial process, but one of the rare opportunities they had to stand before the court and speak directly to the man who had killed their loved one nearly 30 years earlier. Family representatives stood at the podium and described the consequences the case had left over 3 decades. They spoke of the void Robin left in the family, a daughter, a sister, a mother whose life was taken in one violent night. They spoke of the years lived with an unanswered question: who did it, why, and whether justice would ever come. In the courtroom that day was one person whose presence carried special meaning: Nicole Lawrence, the 2-year-old child once found in the house on November 20th, 1994, now a grown woman. Nearly 30 years earlier, she was the child wandering the hallway of the house where her mother had just been murdered. She grew up with the story of the case that she herself had almost no direct memory of, but its impact followed her throughout her life. When she stood in the courtroom, facing the man who had admitted to killing her mother, many in the courtroom realized that this case was not just about a crime in the past. It was about consequences that stretched across generations. Prosecutors then made their sentencing recommendation. They emphasized that the nature of the case was not an impulsive act in a few seconds. Robin Lawrence was stabbed 49 times, a prolonged and extremely violent attack. They also recalled that after committing the crime, Stephan Smerk left the house, leaving a 2-year-old child inside. In addition, they said that for nearly 30 years after the murder, Smerk had lived an ordinary life, unsuspected and unaccountable for his actions. For the prosecutors, that further demonstrated the severity of the crime and the need for a harsh sentence. When the judge entered the final phase of the hearing, the courtroom fell silent. After reviewing the entire case file, the defendant's guilty plea, and all relevant legal factors, the judge sentenced Stephan Smerk to 70 years in prison. For a man of Smerk's current age, this sentence was practically equivalent to a life sentence in reality. In addition to the prison term, the court also ordered Smerk to pay a fine of $100,000. When the sentence was read, many in Robin Lawrence's family held each other's hands tightly. There was no cheering, no complete relief, because for them, no sentence could bring Robin back. But many said that the sentence at least brought some measure of justice after nearly 30 years of waiting. After the hearing, Robin Lawrence's family told the press that they knew their pain would never go away. The case had changed their lives since 1994. But having the killer finally brought to court and convicted closed a long chapter in their lives. As Stephan Smerk was led out of the courtroom to begin serving his sentence, the story that had lasted nearly 30 years finally came to an end. For nearly 3 decades, he had lived freely, built his own life, and believed his crime had been buried by time. But DNA technology and genetic genealogy ultimately brought the truth back to light. The killer was finally imprisoned after nearly 30 years. And while time has passed, the memory of Robin Warr Lawrence continues to live on in her family, in the community, and in the story of a case where justice arrived, though very late. If you want to follow more true crime cases with investigative details never fully told before, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for watching and see you in the next story.